As psychologists, we play a vital role in creating a more just and equitable society by speaking up for the voiceless, realigning health and healing practices, and to understand people beyond interpersonal pathology. What better way than to learn directly from the perspectives of Native American psychologists? What does it mean to be an agent of change, and what does it take? How can we promote culturally responsive and social justice at the practice and academic levels? More importantly, how might we honor the wisdom and resilience of Native American people? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sun. Today, our guest is Dr. Fetter. She is a member of the St. Regis Mohawk tribe and a postdoctoral fellow in Carolina Postdoctoral Program for Faculty Diversity at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As a clinician scientist, Dr. Fetter's research focuses on understanding the role of culturally relevant stressors and protective factors on the mental health and well-being of American Indian and Alaska Native communities. Her most recent article was published in Journal of Counseling Psychology in May 2023, titled The Impact of Historical Loss on Native American College Students' Mental Health: The Protective Roles of Ethnic Identity. Additionally, Dr. Fetter has worked as part of a college internship study team investigating the role of internships and student experiences at minority-serving institutions. For her clinical work, Dr. Fetter applies a strength-based sociopolitical and systems lens to address the impact of ethnic identity and suicide prevention for American Indian and Alaska Natives. As part of our Native American or American Indian Heritage series, Dr. Fetter will be discussing how to become an agent of change in psychology and move the field towards creating a socially just world. Dr. Fetter, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you walk us through your journey and share with us any memorable events and circumstances that may have influenced how you got into this work?
Yeah, I think the first and most influential force for me has always been my family. So I came into this field thinking, of course, that of course, wanted to help people, but I also wanted to be a voice or to have a voice. And I think that comes for me from my Mohawk name, Kawennison, which means her voice is shaking. And I was named after my Dada or grandmother. And the meaning of our name is essentially that we will speak up even when it's difficult, even when our voice shakes, which unfortunately my voice often does, but I guess that's in the name. And my Dada did this in her own way at the time. She stood up for her land rights in our reservation, Akwesasne. And now this name means to me acting with courage, conviction, and humility, even when I'm afraid or nervous in different settings. And so I think that has given me the resilience to continue to pursue higher education and graduate school, even when I didn't believe in myself, because I felt that sense of responsibility towards honestly my name, my Dada, my family, to continue to pursue higher education so that I could become a voice in the field.
It's so powerful just thinking about how strongly one's identity is tied to the name and beautifully named to be able to speak up. And you're usually, speaking up for about easy things, our voice isn't shaking, but usually
Mhm.
our voice is shaking when we are speaking up about difficult subject matters. And you're talking about this idea of speaking up in the field of psychology. For some of our listeners, it may be obvious for what issues we need to be speaking up about. Can you maybe tell me a little bit more about how you have used your cultural lens in speaking up about relevant issues in psychology?
Yeah, I think the first way, my initial reaction to that question is, oh my gosh, I haven't spoken up at all, or what have I spoken up about? So it's so funny to think about how closely held this belief and value is for me, yet how difficult it is to talk about in a way that centers myself. But yeah, I think for me, first just coming into the field and understanding how many Indigenous health equity issues are not being addressed by the field of psychology. I think in my graduate education, there were a lot of moments of realizing not only is psychology coming from such a narrow lens and such a specific set of cultural experiences, ways of knowing or epistemologies, value systems. It also has perpetrated a lot of harm for Native communities and other marginalized communities in the US specifically, of course, also globally. So I think I knew that, right? I knew that from undergraduate experiences. I knew that from my lived experiences that there was a lot of harm perpetuated. But I think joining a field that you have these mixed feelings about has been its own challenge for many reasons. One of those was just finding places of belonging or finding writers who I connected with, theories that I connected with, Indigenous psychology that spoke to specific experiences of Native people. So I think it's been a developmental experience where my first experience of that was in our history and systems class in my graduate education, noticing that they included all the history of the ethnic minority psychological associations at the time. This was before all of them were formed, but they didn't include the Society for Indian Psychologists in my syllabus for our reading. And so I Googled it because I was curious, is this document missing? Is there a reason they didn't include it? And it was right there. So it was a tiny way that I noticed that the narrative of Indigenous psychology was being left out, at least in my graduate curriculum. And so that was I don't know, one of the first times probably that I emailed someone to be like, hey, let's include this because we want to be able to speak to the foundations and the leaders who have shaped Indigenous psychology.
Yeah, actually, that's how I found you. I looked up the organization. So you've also talked about, when you were reading some of the material like histories and systems and it being gravitated towards finding some maybe Native American theories or approaches. Do you have any that is your go-to or something that resonates more with you?
Yeah, one of the things I realize is the people who I'm reading are, they're still with us today. It's blending or bringing together Native epistemologies with psychology. I don't know that it's a terribly deep field. So I feel like the research, the knowledge in these areas are relatively new, and there's a lot of gaps in terms of what we know. Honestly, sometimes pretty shocking gaps. So I think one of the first things I always share with people is a lot of the treatments that we use that are considered, our evidence-based practices, our evidence-based treatments, our EBTs have not been tested with Native communities. And the most recent, I think, review of that, there's maybe a handful of clinical trials that have even included Native participants. So there's such a foundational gap that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, frankly. And we need more Native psychologists in the field to do it. Or perhaps we don't. I mean, it depends on how we want to view this, right? I mean, we can continue to engage in psychology as a discipline, how it serves our people. We can also continue to critique how psychology views the human experience and positions well-being or balance or harmony. So I think there's so many scholars who I looked up to and admired, and there's also a lot still that we need to do.
Hmm. And of the materials that you've read through, as well as some of the scholars that's influenced you, is there, I guess, this distinction? So, folks who are learning about culturally responsive care and cultural humility, what is maybe a takeaway for them as they are thinking about, oh, because I mean, APA recently published a monitor about how many psychologists are actually drawing from Native American healing practices. So I'm curious if there is something you think other psychologists can benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a great question. I wish people asked that question more often. I think this actually is something that's so close to my heart as a way of viewing like the contribution that Indigenous psychologists have. Yeah, I think the most low-hanging fruit is just viewing people from a holistic perspective that allows distress and pain to be a part of our experience and to live alongside well-being. It's to acknowledge that a lot of what's happening for us as beings is not intrapersonal, but rather related to the society, the culture, the community, the environment, the families that we're in, and the experiences that we're having. And so I think having a really dynamic, harmony based, balance based view of human experience makes it easy to approach work with clients from a strength-based perspective. It makes it really easy to see progress and growth and kind of self-actualization. And it also allows us to honor where people are at in their situations and what's realistic. I think that a lot of the emphasis towards focusing so heavily on intrapersonal psychopathology has so many unintended consequences. So I think there's a lot to learn from utilizing harmony or balance-based perspectives. And then, of course,
And
I think the native lens towards understanding human experiences beyond psychological well-being, or maybe thinking about all the different types of well-being that we have. There's more of that research now, I guess, in mainstream psychology, but I think understanding our human experience is one of incredible connectedness above all.
so if I get what you're saying here, making sure I understand, is that oftentimes in psychology, there is just maybe the individual pathology, their symptoms, their depression, it becomes their individual experience.
Mhm.
And we hyper focus on treating just the individual as opposed to also addressing, hey, how's the relationship with the family? How do we intervene in that direction? How are you involved, say, with your community identity or your spiritual identity and so on? All these different facets, a holistic view of who the person is to address this overall sense of well being. Is that what you're trying to say here?
Yeah, I think the elimination of distress is a ridiculous goal.
Okay, can you say more
Yeah.
about that?
Well, the human experience is full of pain. And I know, DBT Act addresses this, but I think even maybe those modalities address the idea that pain is normative and an expected part of our experience, but I'm not sure the broader field or our approach to clinical mental health in general reflects that. I'm not sure we really do have an attitude that our clients can experience growth and change and meaning making and a more satisfying life according to their definitions without eliminating pain or distress.
Yeah, like my goal is symptom reduction.
Right, even our
Right.
outcome measures
Yeah.
pretty much
Yes.
hold that belief system,
Yeah. Yeah.
and, we don't have quality of life measures oftentimes, or many times those outcomes are not included, other
Yeah.
well-being-based measures.
Yeah. Huh. Well, again, you're speaking to someone who grew up in a Buddhist household who believes in this whole idea that life is suffering. Yeah, I totally get it when people are talking about, oh, I want to get better. Wait, how do you define that? What do you mean better?
Right,
Yeah, you keep
right,
chasing after happiness. What's going on here? Yeah.
right.
Now, what is one recommendation you would give to therapists or professionals who may encounter working with a client who identifies as Native American? And I
Yeah,
say this because we do get some clients that are oftentimes biracial, bicultural, and they'll check the box of I'm also Native American, but that's not even brought up in the context of therapy.
mm, yeah, well, hopefully I think the first step right, with any culturally responsive therapeutic approach is always naming and exploring significant cultural identities. So understanding where someone's identity fits and how we're going to be talking about it in therapy. So I think using a really open exploration of what this identity means to you, how it might we imagine it showing up in therapy, how do we want to be holding this identity? And then I think I'm keep debating whether this is the most helpful answer, to be honest. But my first instinct is to acknowledge the profound miseducation that our US public education provides to children about the history of this country, about our relationship with the world, and in so many profound ways. And specifically, the systematic erasure of Native history from our US history curriculum and how that affects our societal understandings of Native communities, Native people, and our relationship with Native communities and nations. And so, my first instinct is to say that listening to this podcast is a pretty phenomenal start. So, I think it's okay to feel pretty good about that. And then I would also think continuing to engage in your own education. So, getting some foundational knowledge about what is the actual history. Because any history that I've encountered in my K through 12 experience was, I mean, just not accurate. And so, getting to hear from Native history, getting to hear from Native storytellers, Native historians, there's a lot more access now than there used to be to really consumable media than we used to have. So now there's podcasts that focus on Native stories. There's TV shows that are funny and, interesting. There's documentaries that, we didn't have before. So there's a lot of ways to desegregate your media that we didn't used to have access to. So I'd encourage people to do that first.
Are there a few that you would name? I mean, I listen to This Land podcast. That's how I
Yes,
learned
that's
about
one I always
I l
name.
oh, I love that, yeah.
Oh, a podcast that I love, All My Relations, is a podcast on a lot of different platforms that I would recommend. And is led by a couple of scholars that folks should also look into. Yeah, I think that would be one I would recommend.
Okay, okay. And as a person of color, can you share with me some of the challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
Yeah, I think one struggle that I had in graduate school, and I'm sure will continue to show up in my life in different ways, is finding Indigenous mentors or mentors doing work focused on Indigenous health to work with who are also using culturally congruent methodologies to approach their work. So I was fortunate enough in my graduate experience to have access to mentors who did conduct community-based, really thoughtful mixed methods work. But I didn't have access to mentors doing work focused on Indigenous communities specifically within my program. So I joined the Society for Indian Psychologists and eventually was able to connect with a group of Native graduate students who were working with Dr. Joseph Gahn, who was volunteering his time to mentor. I mean, if you think about it, pretty extraordinary effort he put in to mentor a group of Native graduate students from across the country from different institutions, in his quote unquote free time that I'm sure he does not have. And we worked together, this group of Indigenous graduate students, along with Dr. Gahn, worked together on a series of systematic reviews on Indigenous suicide. And it was such a transformative experience for all of us that we actually wrote a manuscript talking about and reflecting on this experience and thinking about how this could translate to recommendations for faculty who are working with Native graduate students now or who maybe are interested in becoming a mentor to a Native graduate student. Because we realize that it's going to be a while before we have Native faculty in place. I hope to be one of those faculty, but it's difficult to find that mentorship. And so we need to think creatively, which we're good at, and adaptively in terms of how are we going to find community in different spaces to learn the methodologies, learn the approaches, learn the ways of knowing that we want to be practicing. And that extends to therapy as well. I think a lot of trainees experience a disconnect or a dissonance in learning therapeutic modalities that they do not resonate with, that the communities they serve do not resonate with, and finding resources to do work that you are proud of and congruent with your values is a huge challenge and continues to be.
And the practical realities is that we just don't have enough Native American faculty members. And so I do think that it's also the service to put the onus only on Native American faculty members. So for folks who would like to be an ally, what are some critical things they want to consider if, let's say, they have a student who identifies as Native American or Alaska Native?
Yeah, I think starting with relational approach, getting an understanding of their lived experience with discrimination, their experience with their training thus far. What are they looking for? And what experiences can you provide as a mentor and what can you not provide? A lot of our graduate training is really siloed, which is especially problematic, right, when everything isn't a fit for someone. So if you're working with one advisor or mentor, that can be really challenging if they aren't open to you working with other faculty or mentors. So one really concrete thing that research mentors can do is to suggest that Native students connect with their ethnic minority psychological association to express explicit support for them working with other Native graduate students or faculty, to support them in connecting with other researchers doing work that, if not aligned with the population, aligned with the methodology, aligned with the approach, or another aspect that they can gain experience with. Another thing I see a lot is people feeling ignorant or unprepared and therefore kind of leaning out of the discomfort of becoming a mentor or talking to Native students about their experience. And the one thing I would say is, I can't speak for everyone, but I'm used to that. I'm used to people not knowing almost anything. I'm used to people having a lot of questions or frankly feeling shocked to be meeting a Native psychologist. So I don't think that you're going to break people or that people are fragile. I think just owning what you do and do not know and not using that as an excuse to disconnect from mentorship is actually going a really long way and I think would be really appreciated.
Not knowing, especially if a student is asking you for mentorship, I think the right thing to do for faculties, not just faculties, but as a mentor, is to connect folks or acknowledge, hey, this is my area or which I'm limited in. Let me connect you with some resources. I'm happy to mentor you along the way in whatever capacity I can, rather than, as you mentioned, bowing out of any sort of interaction or relationship with the mentee.
Mm-hmm. And not knowing, we can also learn. So I know we have a limited capacity to learn all information in the world. And I often think we can challenge ourselves a little bit more to learn from mentees and see if we might also be able to support in any of the areas that we may not be as familiar with. So having that kind of flexible approach.
Yeah. Yeah. So in all these examples that we're highlighting, these questions, they're all chipping away at this idea of how do we make psychology socially just for a population that has been marginalized. Is there something else you would like to add to that?
I don't think we're taught to be change makers. I don't think it's comfortable, supported, modeled. We do what we see, we're simple creatures. So I think when we don't see people speaking up, we don't know how. So I think in that way, I've always considered it a privilege that I have gotten to see advocacy and people who are fighting because I feel like it lets me see that it's possible and we can survive through it and we have survived through it. And in fact, that's the only way we've survived. So I think continuing to be self-reflective and engage in reflexivity in our work, in our field, in our clinical practice, in our research, to practice having a critical eye, and then to come to the table willing to speak, even if your voice is shaking, even if you are scared to do so, to find community and coalition in that. I think there's actually a lot of power behind that, but we don't step into it, and we're not exactly taught how to step into it.
So how would you teach folks to step into it?
Try. It's like any new thing, right? I think it's easy to overcomplicate things or to stop seeing things as translatable skills, but anything you do the first time, you're probably not going to be very good at. That's certainly how I feel about this podcast interview, right? Is I'm sort of viewing this as my trial run, and I'm
Mhm.
giving myself space to have an experience that I don't know how it'll go. But I think it's important to practice. So I think in any space that you're in, you can focus on your sphere of influence. You are likely in rooms where you have a perspective that could contribute to creating greater equity in your organization, in your in your higher education space, in your department, in your classroom. And so practicing. I also think watching, learning from other people, seeing what works for them, seeing what's effective, talking to people behind the scenes about what you're noticing and strategizing which one of us might be the best person to approach this. I'd like to say something in this next meeting. Could you run through with me how I might go about saying it? Or could we talk through possible responses that I might get when I bring this up in this upcoming meeting? So I think doing things that are scary is essential and necessary. And we can do it. We can all do it. We do it all the time.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Fetter, thank you very much for sharing that with me, as well as our listeners. How do we support you?
Well, I want to say that there are a lot of researchers that I want to, and scholars and clinicians that I want to, I guess, lift up or highlight that people can support. Native research and scholarship is really undercited and underrecognized. It often gets siloed into kind of its own niche, and then the larger field doesn't incorporate that into how we think about clinical psychology, developmental psychology, whatever it may be. And so knowing who those native psychologists are so that we can incorporate their work is really important. So I wanted to mention people like Art Bloom, Gail Morse, Iva Greywolf, Joseph Gahn, Melissa Walls, Victoria O'Keeffe, Gillian Fish, Maria Crouch, Andre Wigglesworth, Kyle Hill, Nicole Redvers. There are many, many, many Native scholars doing fantastic work addressing Native health equity in public health and psychology that I would encourage people to see, to get out there and see who's out there.
All right. Should be able to find their stuff on ResearchGate, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I will link it as part of our show notes for this
That's
episode.
wonderful.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Fetter, thank you very much for sharing everything that you've discussed with me so far. Thank you for being on this podcast, as well as your commitment to the field.
Yahweh, thank you so much for having me.
I hope you liked this episode. Please subscribe and share. We love to hear from you, so send me a message on LinkedIn or email. The People of Color in Psychology is brought to you by the Multicultural Counseling Institute, and I'm your host, Jack Sun.